started.
There's no bigger ego boost.
Well, no, and Tebby was geschmack. They got everybody out, but at least they got two people out.
Yeah, they got to.
Oh, you didn't hear? So who you were talking about?
No.
Last night they rescued two hostages. They got them out of a building. That was the first part, and then the second part was a nest of terrorists. Then they blew the building to smithereens. The same neighborhood that Biden said don't touch, they blew it to smithereens. It was geschmack. After they saved two hostages, two Yidden got out yesterday. Yeah.
Does he know who won the Super Bowl? 1 minute, Mati.
I was talking to my wife, and I told my wife if they ever put me into Gehenna, they're probably going to sit me down in front of a big screen TV and force me to watch a football game. That'll be my Gehenna. Okay. So before we start, I just want to share today is the yard site of the Lavush. The Lavush had a fascinating story. The last name of the family of the Lavush was Yafi. Yafi because they were extremely, extremely good-looking people. And the Lavush was once in a situation where there was a noblewoman who wanted him and trapped him in her house to do an affair with him. And what he did in order to get out, he was dressed well, he jumped into a sewer, and he actually climbed and escaped her house through a sewer. I'm not sure how that works in those days. In my basement, there is no direct manhole into a sewer, but he jumped into a sewer and he ruined all his clothing, of course. But Baruch Hashem, he got out unscathed, and in the schus of his Mesiras Nefesh, he was Zoicha to write 10 levushim. Hashem gave him 10 levushim because he named his different svarim after the malbushim that are listed off in the Megillah of Mordechai HaTzadik. Mordechai Yotza Belvosh, goes on and on. So he made those most beautiful svarim to levush, and there's a very interesting story. There's a very interesting story about at the turn of the century, there was a bocher in yeshiva that was such an unbelievably good-looking bocher. It was like he stood out. He stood out, and his name was Yafi. And what happened is one day his father came to visit him, and when the yeshiva met the father was taken aback because the father was an ugly, grotesque-looking guy. So the yeshiva gave him a look, as if his eyes were asking, "Is this son adopted? Because how does it come to you?" So he says, "I want to tell you something. I'm an Enoch, we're an Enoch from the Lavush. Our name is Yafi." And after that Nesoyin that our Gzeda went through, he was mispelled to the Rebbeinu Shalom that they should no longer be good looking. They should be ugly. And in fact, they were Zoicha that for 10 generations, everybody was ugly. I'm the 10th generation. So my son went now back to the standard programming. So that's the story of Lavush. Chus Yog and Elena of Al Kol Yisrael.
Years ago, generations.
Lavush was I think the end of the 1700s or beginning of 1800s. It was like way back when. It was like the early Achronim. Zok to Gemara. I'm going back a little bit because we were sort of in the middle of a Gemara. So I'm going to go back almost halfway up on Daf Kuf Aleph on the days. Rava Rami. Rava asked the Stira. Tanan we learned, these are like wood, they're non-edible plants that are used exclusively for dyeing. Are they governed by the rules of Shemitah? So the Mishnah Yesh Lahem Shvius, they are governed by all of the rules of Shemitah. And if you sell them, Uladmeim Shvius, that Kedusha Shvius transfers to anything that you sell them for, because that is how the Kedusha of Shemitah works. Yesh Lambir, we know that Shemitah, if there's none left of whatever you have in your house, in the field for animals to eat, you're no longer allowed to retain anything in your house. So all of the halachas that apply to Shemitah apply to these non-edibles. Non-edibles, they're all the dins of Shemitah. Alma etzim yesh behen mishum kedusha shviyos. You see, wood are subject and governed by the rules of Shemitah. But remaining fact Gemara, alikanim valigafonim shegivivin bechava al pnei hasoda. Someone had leaves of either vines or reeds or whatever it was, and they were literally squirreled away, buried under the ground to be preserved for a later use. Do they have the status of per shmita or not? Zok the Mishnah, it depends. Lokton lachila, if the bailim, when they originally cut it down, had intended to eat it, so they now give this a status of food, and therefore yesh b'hem mishum kedusha shviyas. But la'etzim, if their original intent of the owner was to use that for firewood, ein b'hem mishum kedusha shviyas. So we have a stira. Here we learned that eitzim are not governed by the rules of Shemitah. Yet when we were talking about the earlier woods that are used as dyes, they are governed by the rules of Shemitah. When Mishani and the Gemara answered, not all wood was created equal. Wood that's being used as a cooking fuel to make into coal, that is not governed by the rule of Shemitah. But wood that's being used as a dye, those are governed by the rules of Shemitah. And the difference is how separated are the point where you benefit from it from the point where the item gets consumed. Umishani Amar Karla Achla. What type of items are governed by the rules of Shemitah? Items that are similar to items that are eaten. What is unique? What is a unique property of something that's eaten? It's consumed at the same time that you enjoy it. As you're eating it, you're also enjoying the food and you're benefiting from the nourishment value of the food. Yotu eitzim, but firewood, shana asan acher bi'uran. Anybody who knows how to make a barbecue doesn't put the meat right on the fire. They wait for the fire to die down, and then the log or the coal becomes charcoal, becomes a glowing charcoal. That's what you cook on. So come to Chaysh, if you're going to be using wood to cook with or to provide heat, first it gets consumed by the fire, and only a little bit later is it useful, are you benefiting from it. Something like that is not governed by the rules of Shemitah. But if you have dye, wood they're using as a dye, you put it into a pot, and as the wood is being consumed, the beged is going to be absorbing it. So there it's a hana asana biur and shava. Therefore, dyeing is not different. Dyeing is not different than eating, because I'm not coming at the same time. So something that's used as a dye is in fact governed by the rules of Shemitah. Okay, Gavalti. Now we're going to see here that there's like a twofold thing happening here. This rule of hana asan b'shas biuran, not only does it govern what items are covered by the rules of Shemitah, once you determine that something is governed by the rules of Shemitah, we're going to learn that these same rules apply. The only thing you're allowed to do with items that are governed by the rules of Shemitah is use them for hana that's b'shas bir. So that's why you're not allowed to burn fruit and use it as a coal. You have to have hana b'shas bir. Frank the Gemara, so you're telling me that if I had wood that I was using to light a fire with, and I was actually benefiting from the light of the fire, which happens while it's burning, are you telling me that that in fact would be subject to the rules of Shemitah? Wood that's very oily that you use as a torch, the hana also nubiur shaven, and we know that all wood are exempt from the rules of Shemitah. So how do you explain that? Amarava zakrava, because stam eitzim la saka hin oimdin. So now we've learned a new thing. When you make assessments, there are certain things that you don't need to assess. It's obvious these are for sure items that are primarily used where the hana comes only delayed after they're consumed, such as wood. Yes, there might be an outlier wood that could be used for a torch, but wood as a category by default will not be governed by the rules of Shemitah. Something that's going to be used for a dye by default will be governed by the rules of Shemitah, as well as anything that could be eaten. However, there are certain things that are in a fuzzy area. Like what? Like ale te'enim, ale konim, ale gvanim. They're in a fuzzy area because they can go both ways. So there, the owner actually has the power, or the person who cuts it down, actually has the power to determine what category it fits in. Is this in the wood category, and therefore it's not subject to the rules of Shemitah, or is this in the Michael category? So there are certain things that are defined that there's no wiggle room on, and then there's the ale gefanim and the ale kanim that the owner could define because they go both ways. whether or not what I just said is true, that by default, automatically wood is not governed by the rules of Shemitah, that's going to be totally in a machlokes tonight. The Tanya we learned, in Moisrin Perish Shvius, Loila Mishra Veloila Kfusa. Once you have Perish Shvius, and they're already determined to be governed by the rules of Shemitah, what are you now allowed to do with these pears? You're only allowed to eat them, but you're not allowed to use them to soak and wash. So you soak them in water, and then you put begadim in them to absorb the fragrance, or maybe it acts as a detergent. You're not allowed to use water, pears of shvius for that. And we're going to soon see, Rashi tells us, it's because the way it works is, yes, you put the pears in the water, and they become ruined right away. But your begadim are not benefited until they're there for 3 or 4 days. So this is also a case where ein bi'uran v'hana'asan shava. So the Chacham therefore says you're not allowed to use pears for this function. Rabbi Yosy Aimer, noistin pears shvius l'soicha mishra u'l'toicha kfus. You could do that. So let's try to understand why. My time of the Rabbanon. What is the reasoning for the Rabbanon who do not allow it? Amar Kra, the pasuk tells us, la'achla v'loy l'mishra, la'achla v'loy l'kfusa. There's actually a pasuk that is specifically mamayit uses other than achila, and therefore mishra and kfusa are not allowed. Rabbi Yosy Aimer, I have achla, you're right, which is somewhat restricting, but I have another pasuk that's inclusive. Amar Kra lachem, it says lachem la'achla. So we'll darshan from there, l'chol trachechem. Open it up, broaden it out. You're allowed to use it for things other than just eating. Mishra and kvusa would in fact be allowed. You can't keep it so tight. There still is a word lachem that should broaden, that should include other uses for Shemitah other than eating. So Gemara, no, the Rabbanan says no, it doesn't, because lachem dovid lachla. The only things that would be included are things that are directly similar to the way eating consumes something. And what is that? So you see over here something very interesting. Not only does Hana Asi Ubi'urei Shavin determine what's governed by the rules of Shemitah, once something is determined to be governed by the rules of Shemitah, like peiros, the only uses that are allowed are also uses that are similar to Achila, Hana Asa Ubi'urei Shavin. Yatsu Mishra Kvusa, those uses, Shana Asa Ache Bi'uran, where you only benefit from them 3 or 4 days after the pairs are destroyed, those would not, you're not allowed to do that with pear shemitah. Frank Gemara, how could Rabbi Yosy allow it? Rabbi Yosy then be yoksiv la'achla. It says la'achla as well. So that means it's restrictive. So how could you broaden it to include uses such as mishra and kusa? Or malach, you need the restriction to exclude some other thing. The Tanya we learned, you know what you're not allowed to make out of pear shvius? Ointments. Ointments are not things that you eat. That's what you're not allowed to make out of pear shvius. One second, we're middle of the thought. Who said you should use la'achla to be a ma'ik malugma, Rabbi Yosy? Maybe use la'achla like the Rabbanan did to be a ma'ik kfusa. But we have a riboy. Hare kfusa amar. Frank the Gemara, Hamani Mekayim la'achla. So what am I going to use la'achla for? It excludes making ointments out of pears. Frank the Gemara, you have a riboy of lachem. You have la'achla, which is a meat. Why are you applying la'achla to be ma'it malugma and lachem to be marbe, the kvusa, and mishra, umaros l'rabis kvusa l'hajis malugma? Zok Gemara, that is a svar to that, because marbe needs a kvusa sheshava b'chalon. We're going to include uses that are allowed with pear shvius, things that everybody does. Everybody does kvusa. That's something that we would include in one of the allowed functions of the fruit of Shemitah. But only a small minority of people require ointment. Only people that are injured, people that have infections. So since it's not such a widespread use, that's not going to be considered a use that we're going to allow with pear shvius. So let's stop for just a moment over here. If I asked you, what is the machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and the Chachamim, what I would say is quite simply, it's a machlokes in the Gzeres HaKosov. Does the Gzeres HaKosov allow a more broader use of the pears or not? Right? So what in the world does this have to do with whether or not, by default, an item is designated as wood, which would not be governed by the rules of Shemitah, or if it's designated as food, which are governed by the rules of Shemitah? So where do you see this name of Ketanoi that the Gemara said? That's going to be a mystery that we're going to have to uncover soon. But before we tackle that mystery, I want to get to the two dots. Now the Gemara just introduces another brisa. Kaman Azla Hadatanya. Now that we've clarified this machlokes between Rabbi Yosy and the Chachamim, where the Chachamim do not allow Mishra, do not allow Kvusa, and Rabbi Yosy does, let's see who's the author of the next brisa that we're about to quote. La'achla v'loy l'malugma, la'achla v'loy l'ziluf. Ziluf means you spritz wine over a fire or in the house, so it creates an aroma. It's like it's when you're making a mist out of a liquid. Or la'achla v'loy lasvish v'mena apoktizin. Apoktizin is a solution, a serum that one drinks that make him throw up. Why would someone want to throw up? So the Rishonim tell us there's a famous story by a kiddush where somebody was so full he wanted to have that piece of kishka, but he simply didn't have room for a piece of kishka. So his friend said, "I don't understand. If you want to make room for a kishka, take two fingers, put it down your throat, push down, and that'll release room. You'll be able to have kishka." He says, "Are you crazy? If I had room for fingers, I would have put in a pickle long ago, right?" So this is what apoktizin does. It makes room. Kaman, Rabbi Yosy. This brisa must be according to Rabbi Yosy, because this brisa is saying all of the prohibited uses of Shemitah, and Lamishra and the Kfusa are not items listed as prohibited uses. So obviously, going according to Rabbi Yosy, the Rabbanan Ikanami Mishra Kfusa. If this was the Rabbanan talking, they would have added it to the list of prohibited uses, Mishra and Kfusa. Okay, so now we have a mystery. How do you see over here any question about, do you say that a person could determine what wood's function is, or if it's automatic, right? Stam eitzim is to burn. So let's see Rashi. And if you know it's a long Rashi, you know it's not going to be simple. Okay, so let's see what it says. Yotze Mishra Kvusa. Zokt Rashi. Shemishah Shematilan Pishtan. I beged biyayin. From the point where you place the beged into the wine, Niskalkel, right away it ruins the payers. Unavire, and it's destroyed. But Vahana Osai, the benefit that you realize only comes 3 or 4 days later, until the point where if it's raw wool, it's considered soaked and saturated. Now the question of now let me explain to you how this is a machlokes tanoim, whether or not stam eitzim is lahasaka. And the Rashi is going to offer up shot in this Gemara that simply doesn't say so. But let's see what Rashi says. Behind the Tanoi, the Rabbanan Savri, the Rabbanan hold, stam peiros lachila. Normal peiros, by default, only go lachila. You can't change that. Therefore, v'chayla alayu kedusha shvius, and once they're designated by default that they're eating, they're things that are eaten, they're subject to the rules of shvius. Kedamar and leo. Never mind when they're picked off the tree. As they're growing, they're always destined to be la'achila. The chaldover shanosa yuburay shava chayla hilcha chafilu loktan lemishru. Even if you said, no, I don't want to pick these items for eating, I want to pick them lemishru kfusa. So if I'm designating them as something other than their default, maybe I should have a koyach to do that. And now we should treat it like firewood. And maybe these fruits should not be mishubed to the rules of Shemitah. Zok Rashi, your machshava will not help to make them ois shmita. It won't make them like the alikonim, where we said your decision does impact what these payers are. The mishru, those are mutter, if you had in mind that you're picking them for firewood. The hastam stamayu lahachi. The leaves, they can go either way. Since they can go either way, it's left to the person who cuts it down to determine what the future of these pears will be. Pears, but if it's actual fruit, that has a default function that you are not able to change. Staman lachila, umishas yitzirasan chayil kedushasan. The moment they're growing, they're already subject to all of the restrictions of Shemitah. V'suloi mahani machshava lav kuye. You can't undo that default because you decided that you want to use the fruit for some unconventional purpose. And therefore, Vasur and Lamishra, once they're designated with Kedusha Shvias, according to the Rabbanon, you're not allowed to soak them. The Ein Nehenin B'Kedusha Shvias, Elahana Hadayim Elachila. The only type of benefit you're allowed to have from Kedusha Shvias is Hana that comes as the item is getting consumed. And as we already established, Mishra and Kvisa doesn't work that way. But on the flip side, you can go Lakula as well. By default, wood, firewood, or wood is always considered firewood by default. Therefore, even if you had specific hana, when you were cutting this branch down, not hana, specific kavana, when you were cutting this branch down, I'm using this as a torch, you can't change the default. You could only change the default on non-defined items, like the alekanim. But something that's the vast majority of this is used, la saka, it will not have the status of Shemitah, and your das won't change that. Rabbi Yosy says, Lo yamrinon stam peres lachilanit. You don't say just because it was formed as a fruit, by default, it automatically has the halachas of Shemitah. Umahanu b'machshava, yet he argues and says, no, if I decide that I want to use the ali ta'enim, I apologize. If I decide I want to use the peris, if I decide that I want to use peris for the non-conventional way, not to eat them, rather I want to use them for a hana that's delayed, just like the alekanim mikvanim, where I have the right to determine which way it'll go. We treat it just like alekanim. So even things that are predefined, you can actually say and designate, no, I'm not using this la'achla. Now it also has a tzarachumra. Could be according to Rabbi Yosy, if you're picking wood and you have specific kavana to use it for light, it might yes be governed. So why is this difficult? Because if we learn the Gemara, it's mashma here that Rabbi Yosy agrees to the Rabbanon that once something is designated as a food item, you're not allowed to use it l'mishra l'kfusa. That's how it's mashma from this Rashi. Because Rashi, the whole machlokes is whether or not, if I cut down the fruit, can I designate it as a non-edible, right? So the Rabbanon holds you cannot, and Rabbi Yosy holds you could. But from our Gemara, it's mashma that we're talking about something that was already designated as an edible. And the question is, now that your fruit that's covered by the rules of Shemitah, are you allowed to use those fruit l'mishra? And you learn it out of Psukim, yes or no? So the problem is, Rashi has a totally different shot in our Gemara than what seems to be apparent from the Gemara itself. The Gemara seems to indicate that it's a shayla of exeris hakosov, what is allowed to be done with Peres Shemitah and what not. And Rashi has nothing to do with that. Everybody agrees once it's designated as an oichel, you're not allowed to use it l'mishra l'kfusa. The whole chiddush of Rabbi Yosy is if when you pick those pears, you had always intended to use it l'mishra, then it doesn't get a classification of a peri, and therefore it won't be subject to any of the rules of Shemitah. That's not what the mashmoyis of the Gemara is. So that is a shtickle problem. So the Pnei Yeshua, without the Pnei Yeshua, I wouldn't be able to make heads or tails out of the Gemara. Now at least I can say that the Pnei Yeshua explains this, even though I don't understand the Pnei Yeshua good enough, but at least we know that the Pnei Yeshua also has this problem. But the Pnei Yeshua actually is very, very clear, and I think easy to understand. And the reason why I'm looking it up inside is because I forgot what he said. So I would just look it up inside to remind myself. But he asked exactly this kasha. So he's quoting Rashi. I need to know Hilchach afilu l'kat mishra. Rabbi Yosy savar l'kat mishra v'davar shenos v'achibur. Akan l'shonim. U'pirusha nira dochak moi. I think Rashi's prat is very difficult to understand because the man leim alone the l'ktayot of Rabbi Yosy v'Rabbanon is heichad l'loktan l'mishra. Rashi now says the whole machlokes is when I cut these pears down, did I have in mind to eat them or did I have in mind to use them for some other purpose? And therefore, according to Rabbi Yosy, it's not at all governed by the rules of Shemitah. That's not what the Gemara seems to be saying. We're speaking about pears that are actually governed by the rules of Shemitah. And the question is, what are those rules of Shemitah? Do the rules of Shemitah allow such a use? Kedemashma pasha the milk. V'yoid kosher frikta pnei Yeshua to the parish Rashi heichad lockdown lachila. According to Rashi, if you actually took down the pears and you had kavanah that you're eating these pears, Rabbi Yosy, the asr litem l'mishul kfisa. Rabbi Yosy would be maida. Right? Rashi's explaining that Rabbi Yoshi's Shita is if you picked it for another purpose other than Achila, you designate it as a non-oichel. But if you designate it as an oichel, that's it. You can't use it l'mishul l'kvitza. But the Gemara doesn't seem to say that. My maksha Gemara. What is the Gemara asking on Rabbi Yossi? Rabbi Yossi inami yaksiv lo'ach. Why is that a kash on Rabbi Yossi? Maybe the psukim here are referring to if he was locked on for the purpose of achila, and there you have the achla v'lo mishra. Rabbi Yossi is speaking about something that's not that. So that's why Rashi is so difficult. But near Lafia these deities of complaining Shua. We should the mashma the Rashi the efshir loymar the pluktayud Rabbi Yossi v'Rabbanon v'loktam lachila. Rashi was backed into a corner because Rashi understood that it's impossible to argue that the way we learned the Pashtus in the Gemara, that it's a discussion of what you're allowed to do with payers that have already received the designation of payers with the Kedusha Shvius. It's impossible that that's the machlokes of Exeris HaKosov as to how it can be used. You know why? Dimkain, Mayer Yemishra Kvusadasher. Why is the discussion between Rabbi Yossi and the Rabbanan only by Mishra Kvusa? There's so many other cases where you can argue that typically the Kaimalon, the Chalaroy Lamaichal Adam, also Lahachal Behema, Bishvias. We can ask another Shiloh. We know there's a rule that anything that's Maichal Adam you're not allowed to serve to a Behema, right? So how come we're not learning? How come we're not learning that from here? So it cannot be Exeris HaKosov that you're allowed to do other things. Because if it's Exeris HaKosov allowed to do other things, why are you dafka applying the Exeris HaKosov to Mishra and Kvusa? There's so many other things you could apply the Exeris HaKosov. So therefore, Rashi held that, and the Gemara held, that it must be that they're arguing about what designated. So it's literally taking the pashtus of the Gemara out of it and saying that the machlokes is obviously about what designated. So what are all these psukim about? So let's have a quick look. Okay. It must be that the discussion is that when he originally took it and he designated it as a non-food item, and that's what the machlokes is. Why do you need the pasuk of lachem? Mikrad lachem the mashma the betchila mutter lelaket lechol tzarchechem. So he's not learning from lachem that even though it's already payers shvius, you're allowed to use it for anything you want. He's doing pasuk lachem is that when you cut it down, lachem you can determine what you want to use it for. And the chacham say no. If it's something that's a food item like a fruit, it's la'achla. You cannot say no. I'm using it for a non-food purpose. So it's sort of changing the way we understood the pashtus that one. The machlokes Rabbi Yossi and the chachamim is, if it's a food item, do I have the ability using lachem to say I'm designating it as a non-food item or not? But avada, once it is a food item, everybody agrees you for sure cannot use it l'mishra u'l'kfusa. Now, Toysa says something very interesting, that we've just twisted ourselves into a knot to understand Rashi's pshat. But really, you don't need to worry about it, because Rashi, that has the same sugi and sukkah, has a whole different pshat in this Gemara anyway. So we'll just learn the first couple of lines to see what the other pshat was. Pirish. This is how Rashi learns in Sukkah. Kol eitzim v'shvius have a pluk to the Tanoi. All eitzim on the Shemitah year, there's a machlokes Tanoim. Is behu kedusha shvius. Do you say that the kedusha shvius applies to wood? Kivan the time of the sharina lahu. Why were we matter wood? Hainim shum danos nachibura. The reason why we were matter wood is because you're not benefiting from them while they're being consumed. In Kain Rabbi Yossi, the less ledrasha than also you be shava. Rabbi Yossi rejects the whole drasha of a nasi b'yishura legabe what you're allowed to do with perish shmita, but then by default he's also going to reject that drasha in defining what is covered by the rules of shmita, and therefore even the less ledrasha than nasi b'yishava linyan perish shvius hachanami loydarish lo inin lochol kedusha shvius. The same way he says you're allowed to do anything with perish shvius, he's also going to learn that there is no restriction as to what's covered by the Yisurim Shvius. And therefore, wood will also be covered by the Yisurim Shvius. That means wood is also time Shemitah, according to Rabbi Yossi. So Rabbi Yossi is now no more Akula. He's a massive chumrah because now he's saying everything is included in this of Shemitah. So then Tosfos asks the obvious question. Then Rabbi Yosy, how can you ever cut down wood? How do you know this wood is not left over from the Shemitah year? You find wood lying on the floor. You don't know when it grew. So how could you ever use any wood? There's so much more wood on the ground that probably was not from a Shemitah year. That's why you can use wood. Or it's a whole different thing. But there's a whole different shot of the sukkah. There are other Achmanim who say, I'm not even going to bother for answering Rashi here, because anyway Rashi was chayzer and says a different shot, so let's not bother. At least if they should have bothered, so that we're at least able to make heads or tails out of this Gemara. Okay, now that we're behind, under the gun, because it's 6:34 and we're barely finished Amud Aleph, we are going to have to rush up. Zok more about Rabbi Yehuda Omer. I'm sorry, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Ima Shvach. So Rabbi Yehuda says that you don't say the fellow was koina for making the wrong die, rather the woman that deviated from his mission gets the worst of both deals. Either he gets only a tziyah, that's less, or he only gets shvach. Yosef Rabbi Yosef Achayt Rababa. Rabbi Yosef was sitting behind Rababa, Kamed Rav Huna, and they were all sitting in front of Rav Huna, listening to Rav Huna's shir. So Rababa was in the front row, Rav Huna was in the second row. But Yosef Rav Huna, Vik Omar, and Rav Huna was saying shir. And in the shir, he said Alachik Rabbi Shua ben Karcha, and he said Alachik Rabbi Huda. So we don't know yet which halacha they're talking about, but that's what Rav Huna said. Junior Rabbi Yosef Lapei, Rabbi Yosef turned around and he spoke to the guy behind him. It doesn't say who was sitting behind Rabbi Yosef, but whatever it was, he turned behind to tell the guy behind him, Amar, I don't understand what great chiddush Rav Huna is saying in shir. I understand why he needed to teach us that we pass like Rabbi Shua ben Karcha. Itrich, because we don't even know what Rabbi Shua ben Karcha says here. I would have thought that you don't pass like Rabbi Shua ben Karcha because he's a yachid against the rabbim. Kamash milon halacha kiyah. And Rav Huna wants us to know that in this case, passing like the yachid, who was the case? Rabbi Shua ben Karcha mahi. The tell you Rabbi Shua ben Karcha Imer milva b'shtar ein nefroi mehen milva al peh nefroi mehen mibnei shu kamat l'mayod. There's the halacha is you're not allowed to pay a guy back his chayv. You owe a guy money. You're not allowed to pay him back on the day of his chagah because he's going to say Baruch Yashke, Baruch Mangetchke, I got paid back. You're not allowed to let a guy pay you back either if he owes you money, because he's going to say, Baruch Mangetchke, that I was able to pay back. So therefore, you do not pay back loans nor receive payment on loans on Yom Deim, on the days of their chagah. But that's only if it's a milva b'shtar, where you know you'll be able to collect after Yom Tov. You have good proof. But if it's a milva al peh, and you don't really have such a good guarantee that you're going to get paid, if he wants to pay you, take it while he's willing to give it to you. So therefore, milva b'shtar ain't a fraymahen, a milva al peh a fraymahen. Why? Because otherwise you might never get it. So that's who we paskin like. Ela halachik Rabbi Yehuda. Why did Rav Huna need to tell us that we paskin like Rav Huna? Lamali. Why do I need Rav Huna to tell me that? I would know anyway, because machlokes v'achakach stam. There's a rule that whenever there's a machlokes about something in the Mishnah, and then later on it's quoted as a stam Mishnah, that's a sign that we paskin like the stam Mishnah. Machlokes v'achakach stam halachik stam. So where's the machlokes? The Bava Metzia, the Bava Kama, in our very Mishnah that we just learned. Let's follow Adam, the Tzavei Shachar, Shachar v'Tzavei Adam. Rameir Ayman Noisn Lo Demet Simroi means he's kinded because he was Mashana, and Rabbi Yehuda is Machmer and says Aymer he's much harder on the merchant. Rabbi Yehuda Aymer Imashvach Yesra Litzia Noisn Lo Esa Yitzia the Meitzia Yesra Lashvach Noisn Lo Esa Shvach. So that's where we have a machlokes in our Mishnah. Where is the stam in Bava Metzia? Ditnan. There's a big grand rule stated there. If you deviate from your contract, you have the bottom hand. So there's a Stam Mishnah, which basically is passing like Rabbi Yehuda. So the question is, why would Rabbi Huna need to tell me that we passing like Rabbi Yehuda? We have the overall general rule that halacha is Stam Mishnah if it's a machlokes v'achach stam. So Dr. Gemara, you know why Rabbi Huna wanted to tell us this? Rabbi Huna itrich because I would have thought ein seder l'mishnah. I would have thought maybe we reject that rule of machlokes v'achach stam halachik stam, because maybe it's out of order. How do you know that the machlokes came first? Maybe the stam came first, because ain't seder l'mishnah. The Mishnayos were not set in order. And maybe what you think is a machlokes v'achach stam is actually the opposite. It's actually a stam v'achach machlokes. So Rav Huna wanted to say, forget all the other rules. I'm telling you, we pass like Rav Yehuda. I got Rabbi Yosef. Ihachi, according to Rabbi Yosef says, I didn't need you to tell me. Because his point is, Ihachi kol machlokes v'achach stama nema ain't say the Mishnah. Right? Ustam v'achach machlokes. So then the whole rule is out the window. The moment you say that I can't rely that something's written in a specific order, then the whole rule is out the window. Rav Huna, no. Kiloy amrinon. When don't you say ain't say the Mishnah? So when do you not say ain't say the Mishnah? Is pechad mesechta, which means in one mesechta there is say the Mishnah. In one mesechta it's written in order. I will betray mesechtas, but from Bava Kama to Bava Metzia, amrinon. Maybe the stam was said first. Rabbi Yosef held you do have a raya here. You know why? Because he holds kulun nezikin chad mesechti. All the three babas are one mesechta. So therefore, he does have the rule of stam of machlokes v'achach stam. Or maybe there's another reason why we know that for sure the halacha is like the stam. Mishum de katani law gabe hilchos hapsikta. It's a shaila if this means that there the discussion matter is discussing final piskei halacha, or if it's the way it was phrased. Kol hamishana yodei latachtoina, kol achoyze ba yodei latachtoina. So that's a definitive psak, and that's why we pass like that no matter what. And therefore, Rabbi Yosef didn't understand why you have Huna. For that, I'm paying tuition. I could have figured that out on my own, right? What if someone gives money to a shliach? So we're talking about somebody deviating from what he was supposed to do, but he wasn't doing things; he was doing something else. Someone gave money to a shliach. And what was going to happen here is someone had money and someone was going to be a worker. It's a typical venture capitalist. He gives him, here's $1,000. You go buy schar with it, and you'll sell it as a profit, and we'll split the profit. You're going to do the work, and I'm providing the working capital. So he sends somebody likach. The deal was that they were going to invest in wheat, and the fellow did not what the balabais wanted him to. And he decided, no, I'm going to buy barley. Or soirin, they made up that they're going to buy soirin. So there's a steer in Brashas. Tanya chada in pachsu loy, then my siroi, which is similar to Rabbi Yehuda Shita. That I'm sorry, this is not similar to Rabbi Yehuda Shita. This means, this is not similar to Rabbi Yehuda Shita because this tells me that we consider it like it's completely the shliachs and the bailam has no connection to that purchase, whether it went up or if it went down. Right? We look at him as a free agent. He's not doing this on behalf of the bailam. So whatever happens is his. If it goes up, it's his. If it goes down, it's his. But for Tani Chada, in Pichsu loy, he has to accept the losses for not buying the proper product. But then Vaisira Yashir Lepsa. So that's more like Rabbi Yehuda, where the shliach gets the lower hand because he has everything to lose and nothing to gain. So we have a steer in Bryce. How do you understand these steers? It's very simple. If you did something wrong, he did something different, he's kaina. That's the first price. And that's why it's completely his independent investment, and the owner has nothing to do with it. The price that says that the bailam has a chelik in it if it goes up, or Rabbi Yehuda, damer shino ein kaina. So if shino ein kaina, how come the bailam doesn't suffer if it goes down? Because if it goes down, the bailam will say, I send you to help me, not to mess me up. So on the upside, the bailam gets. On the downside, the bailam is protected. Matzka flaw, Rabbi Lozer. So Rabbi Lozer had a kasha. Mimai, who said that you have to say that this machlokes is totally the machlokes tanoim? Why can't we say everybody agrees? Mimai, Dilma Atkan like come Rabbi Meir. Where did Rabbi Meir say that the shlichus koina elabimidi the chazid lay ligufei? I sent him to dye it red, and he dyed it black. What was I going to do with that wool? I needed it for myself. My wife wanted a red dress, not a black dress. So a black dress is useless to me because I'm using it for my own purposes. If it's really an investment, do I really care if he bought chitin or siren? As long as it went up. What if he went and realized that there's a better chance of making money on siren? Do I really care? I'm just trying to make money anyway. So maybe Reb Meir would agree that when he's buying schayra, it's not called shinu koina, and therefore you would say that haisiru le'emtza, the Bailam also has a chelik of the gain because he doesn't really care. He's not so adamant. Only do what I told you to do. Nevertheless, if it goes down, he's still protected because he still has the taina of l'sekuni shedartich v'lo lavasi. I made you a shliach to help me, not to mess me up. Ella Amar Rabbi Lazar. Therefore, Rabbi Lazar argues on Rabbi Yochanan, who wants to say this is a machlokes tanoim, and he wants to say that it could all be Rabbi Meir. Hava Rabbi Meir v'lo kasha. Kan lachila kan l'schayv. When the Brisa says that regardless, the Bailam has nothing to do with it, not l'toiv, not l'ra, that's when it was lachila. He wanted chitin, he didn't want soyer. So therefore, there's hakpada in Gansen, and therefore he's not part of the deal. But if he was just going to be buying it to sell to make money, he doesn't really care, and therefore we'll say he's still kain. Okay? So to Gemara, machaku Allah b'marava. In Marava, they literally laughed Rabbi Yochanan out of the Bismedrish. Machaki Allah b'marava Rabbi Yochanan. They mamish were laughing at him. Rabbi Yochanan, who was forced to say that this is a machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim. How are you going to understand the Brisa of Rabbi Yehuda? Brisa of Rabbi Yehuda means I told you to go buy chit. You went and bought soyer, right? You went and bought soyer. So we're going to say that the Bailam has a chelik in those soyer. Even though you didn't do what I asked you to do, I have a chelik in those soyer, and therefore if it goes up, I get the benefit. Frekt the b'nei my Rav Rabbi Yochanan, aliv Rabbi Yehuda. How in the world was there a kinyan? How in the world did the Baal Mois get a kinyan in these chitin that were bought improperly? So the way the Gemara expresses it is the Baal Chitin was never maknid to the Baal Mois. I think the shadow of the whole kinyan. You're not my shliach. So how in the world did I get it? How in the world did I have any ownership in this that I could benefit from it if it goes up? The chitin that the shliach bought when he was supposed to buy soyer. So the Gemara asks Hashem the b'nei Marava. Matzkel Rab Shmuel bar Sisrati, according to you b'nei Marava, that if he's not doing exactly what I told him to do, therefore I wasn't kind anything. Well, what if he did do what he was supposed to do? What if he was supposed to buy chitin and he was buying chitin? Weiter, the person selling this shliach chitin has no idea that this shliach is buying it for somebody else. So I feel chitin nami loy. How is he cutting it that way? He goes to the store, he buys. No one's being maknit to the person who's investing. Omar Bavo, Zokravo, shiny chitin v'chitin, the shlichus of it. We don't need the seller to be maknit to the buyer because I'm a shliach. When you're maknit to me and I'm working on behalf of somebody, the shlichus works. But when I'm buying something that I was not appointed to do, I don't have a shlichus. So therefore, it's very simple. The chip to me, and actually, I'll show you that when you're actually fulfilling your shlichus, even though the person giving it to you doesn't realize that it's going to a third party, that works because you're a shliach. Take that, and I'll prove it to you. Titnan, we looked in the Mishnah. Somebody said everything that I own is hektish. Someone said erchialai, so he owes $1,000 to hektish, and now they're coming to collect. The halach is the gizbar now is in the case of makdish nechasov, the gizbar is taking everything I own. In the case of erchin, if I'm not paying up, the gizbar has access to anything I own to be able to pay my promise. So the halach is when the gizbar goes, he has no right to take away this man's wife's clothing. That's not his. That's hers. He cannot take the children's clothing. What if he gave out a beged to a dyer to dye on behalf of his wife? And it's by the dyer. Whose beged is that? Zokt the Brisa, that's also not the husband's beged. Because, we'll see why soon, that is also not the husband's beged. That's considered the wife's beged, and therefore the Gizbar does not have access to that. That's what we're going to be focusing on soon. If you bought them brand new shoes, you didn't even give it to them yet. They didn't even wear it yet. We still consider it belonging to the children, to the wife. Again, the Gizbar doesn't get to take that. Correct the Gemara V'amai. Lema hakadami. Mi idea letzava sheyikna tziva leisha. How the guy who dyed it? How did he know that he should be makna the tzeva that he dyed the wool to the isha? How does he know? Elamai, the tzeva should belong to the bailam, to the husband, and why isn't that fair game for the gizbar to take? Elav mishum darmino deshlichusay kovid uchayadish toidami. When he gave Idit Seva, when he gave him the wool to get done on behalf of his wife, he was acting as his wife's agent. So it doesn't make a difference if the person doing the dyeing knows who it's for. He's doing it for what he thinks is the man, and the man is the shlich of the woman. So you see this concept. Therefore, if I'm buying chitin on behalf of a third party, even though the seller doesn't know who he's being makna to, he thinks he's just being makna to the person who showed up in the store. Since that person who showed up in the store has a shlichus, has a mandate, it's nikna to his mishalech. Beautiful. Amar Bava. Bava said, Loy, you have no right from here at all. You're going to ask me, Oy Batzoy, why doesn't the Gizbar have a right to take that? That's because there's an exclusion made in the way he was makdish. Kol makdish nechosov ein daitoy al ksusishto yubanav. It's not pshat, it's not his, and they have a right to everything that's his. That's not pshat. Pshat is there's a specific exclusion for all of these types of products. When I was makdish it, I specifically excluded all these types of products. So they're not included in my nether. That's why the Gizbar cannot get them. For the Gemara, the obvious cash would be by Erechin, that's not the case. By Erechin, that's just the Erech Eloi. Now anything that's technically mine, they can seize. So that's the kasha of Toys was asked. But the Gemara asks a different kasha. Matzkav lo Reb Zera. V'chidaito shel adam al tefillah. Let me ask you a question. When you're makdish everything that you own, do you also have in mind to be makdish your tefillin? Surely not. Utanan hamakdish nechasav man like tefillin. He's got to buy his tefillin back. He has to borrow money because he has no money. He was makdish everything. He's got to borrow money to buy back his tefillin. Amalei Abaye in daito shel adam al tefillin. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry. A person is thinking about his film and he's planning to give it because a makdish nechaz of savar, someone who's makdish all of the chazim thinks to himself, mitzvah kavdina. I'm doing a mitzvah, so yes, I'm doing a mitzvah. I'm even going to give my tefillin. But my tefillin, if I give up my tefillin, my wife won't be angry at me. But if I give up her clothing, so therefore that's not included, and this is included. It's also talking about what the Gizbar can take if he's chayve erchen. Which Nana we learned chayve erchen memashkinoisa. But if you're mechayve yourself erchen, so you made a pledge that's $1,000, they're allowed to come and seize property. The Gizbar can seize property from you to make sure you pay up. Are you telling me when a person was makabel upon himself erchen, he had in mind to jeopardize himself that they'll seize his property? He bet if I have money, I'll pay. Nobody, when he's making a donation, has in mind that they're going to take my car away. He's hoping to have cash. So if it's all totally in what the level of his commitment is, so how could the Gizbar come and take all these things? Whenever someone is makdish his nechasav, in order to protect his wife and his family's assets from the claws of the Gizbar, it's as if nasakami shehikne lahen ksus ishto yubanav meikar. Whenever somebody gives everything away to hektish, we say by default he was already makne everything that he doesn't want to give automatically to his wife and children with a specific union, and therefore it's out of the grasp of the Gizbar. And the same thing when a guy says erchielai, when someone accepts upon themselves a big liability, first he'll put everything in his wife's name. This is where it comes from. Before someone makes a big donation and takes upon himself a big liability, the first thing he'll do is he'll put everything in his wife's name. Okay, we'll stop here. Be'ez Hashem, we will be tomorrow. Everybody should have a wonderful, wonderful day. And again, I want to wish Rabbi Levi a good morning. It's so nice to see you. We got to see you for a flash. So good morning. Or good afternoon. And we should hear Shalom in Yisrael. We should soon hear the end of the war and the hostages should be released and all the soldiers should return in good health.
I have a story.